Good evening, everyone. I'm Manish Samnani, the presenter of this FB Live program. And with me here at Faith Bangladesh is Alison Golding from London. And Alison is a presenter in the 5 faculty delegation for the ongoing Expressive Art Modalities Conference here in Dhaka, Bangladesh. Welcome, Alison.
Thank you.
Both of us are at Faith Bangladesh now. Faith is a multidisciplinary clinical therapy services that delivers quality therapy services to children who approach them for special needs. It's a multidisciplinary services where the child receives individualized need-based programs. Apart from the clinical services, Faith is also actively involved with research, education and training, and has a lot of innovations in technology as far as clinical services are concerned, and also disseminating information, awareness and education programs to further down to all the people of Bangladesh. We welcome Alison Golding. Alison is a founder director of Movement Works, and she has developed her own program which we will talking to her about. But first, Alison, tell us something about the ongoing 5-day program that you are a part of. What is the program about and what is your contribution to it?
Yes, so we're involved in a very exciting program here at Bangladesh, Faith, and we are supporting children who have autistic spectrum conditions and diagnoses of autistic spectrum conditions, addressing their needs through the lens of the expressive arts. So we're looking at how the expressive arts can help with their optimal development, and I'm specifically involved in how dance can support that objective.
Alison, tell us something about your specific program that you have developed and you are following and practicing in your organization.
Yes, so Movement Works has developed a specific program called Developmental Dance Movement. This was born out of my research interest in the relationship between movement and cognition. So we're looking at the way that movement, when we think about movement, we often think about how movement can help our body, but this is specifically using movement as a tool, as a learning tool, to develop our cognitive development. And in particular, this program is aimed at the development of young children. So we're talking about using this movement approach to facilitate development of children from around 2.5, sort of, they have to be ambulant to access the work, up to around about 8 years old.
Thank you, Alison. Tell us something more about why and how movement is important for learning in children.
It's one of the areas that has been historically neglected, this what I call body-brain relationship, but it's a growing area of interest, particularly in the scientific context. Particularly my interest is in neuroscience. There is a growing body of evidence all across the world. It's a global movement. We refer to it as experiential learning. Some scientists refer to it as embodied cognition. And it's the way that we can optimize our learning through the full use of the body.
Sure. And how is this thinking, this learning or this scientific understanding important for children with autism?
It's actually important for all children, and in fact it's important for all of us. We all learn better when we involve our whole body in the learning process. Unfortunately, in the context of our education system, we often think of learning as happening from the neck up, but the more we involve our body in the learning process, the better we are able to build those neural connections. So even as adults, after around about 35, 40 minutes, without moving, our brains start to go to sleep. With children, that time span is much shorter. So this is about using movement as a tool to optimize the way that the body and the brain connect and to build optimal cognition through movement.
Talking about the evidence for this approach, and I know that you have done a paper along with an occupational therapist over this developmental dance and movement program. How did that happen, and what did it lead to?
Yes, so we are a research evidence-based led organisation. So because I'm coming at this work from the perspective of being a dance scientist, so I have a master's in dance science, we are looking at building and contributing to an evidence base. As I've mentioned, there is a growing body of evidence linking movement and cognition, and it's coming from various different perspectives globally. This is about using dance, which is quite an innovative approach within this context. And I have teamed up for the first research paper with an occupational therapist because I'm interested in interdisciplinary practice, particularly using this work to serve the needs of children who need extra help or extra intervention from a movement perspective to help them manage and have gains in this area through a movement approach. So you're an occupational therapist, aren't you? So this is an interesting area for me because I think the way forward for serving our special kids is through the expressive arts, but also through interdisciplinary practice. So that if you like, you could consider dance to be, when it's an intentional intervention like this is, to sit somewhere in between occupational therapy, physiotherapy, speech and language therapy, and sensory integration therapy. So it's a fully rounded, holistic approach to serve individual needs of children with some kind of developmental delay or neurological difference.
Sure, sure. So the paper with the occupational therapist, you see a complete crossover between what you have developed as a dance and movement program and the typical occupational therapy sensory integration based kind of a program. What did you find in the study as an evidence to this program? Is there a strong evidence out there?
There is, and I'm going to deal with this question in two parts. So when you were asking in the first part about the crossover, it's not a complete crossover, but I find the bridge between the disciplines of interest, because your objective as an occupational therapist, a lot of people necessarily aren't aware of what those objectives are as an occupational therapist, and they're broad, aren't they, depending on who you're working with. But one of those objectives is a sensory integration objective, is it not?
Correct.
Yeah. So we know from a neurological perspective, when we look at neuroanatomy, that the somatosensory part of the brain, which sits in the parietal lobe, and the motor cortex, which sits in the prefrontal, are neighbours. So even from a neural anatomical point of view, we're unable to separate those two trajectories. They are totally integrated in the way that our brain works. So when we think about optimising and developing our sensory experience, we necessarily have to think about optimising our motor experiences. So that's the first aspect of my interest in developing an interdisciplinary relationship between the two. In terms of the evidence base, there have been two papers specifically about the developmental dance movement program that have been published. The first one was in the British Journal of Occupational Therapy, supported by the perspectives from an occupational therapist, because I think what's really rich in the interdisciplinary perspective is that we can start to nurture the gains from two angles. And I think what dance has to offer is this fantastic ability to produce an intrinsic motivation in the child. Because let's face it, the arts are something that children gravitate towards because they're fun to do. And when it's delivered in a fun, feel-good way, and music has a huge part to play, because generally when we dance, we also involve music, and that can be a hook and an anchor to really engage the child. And when you have a child's engagement, then you have fantastic opportunity to progress their development in an accelerated way.
Sure. And how would you say, is there a relation or a crossover with the autism movement therapy that we have been reading and learning about in this conference?
Yes. So, as I was explaining, one of the papers has been published in the British Journal of Occupational Therapy, and that was an autism-specific approach to writing about the evidence base and considering the evidence base. The other paper has been published in the Journal of Research and Dance Education. Both of these perspectives underpin that this approach is beneficial for all children. As I mentioned earlier, it's really an approach that's appropriate for all children and everybody, really. But the research benefits that are coming back is that children with special educational needs or additional needs do particularly well, and especially children with autistic spectrum conditions. So my professional relationship with Joanne Lara, the founder of Autism Movement Therapy, has been because the two different programs were developed entirely separately. However, they do mirror each other in terms of the overall similarity of the approach. So, for example, patterns and sequencing, specific movement patterns that we know facilitate children's neural connectivity. The use of imitation, which of course is an aspect of dance that is intrinsic in the modality of dance. We learn dance through copying somebody else, at least at the beginning, before we develop our imaginative and creative skills as we begin to learn more vocabulary. And then, of course, the repetition piece. And I think that, again, is intrinsic in the dance modality, because when we dance, we have to rehearse and repeat. It's part of the art form.
Sure. And where do you and how do you see it can promote or be a part of a school program? Because schools have a primary focus on learning, but at the same time, they want children to be a little more still, a little more in one place, and just the opposite of what a typical dance and development movement program or such a program would typically say.
That's a very interesting question. I think there has to be a paradigm shift globally. Our education system grew up many years ago when the world looked very different. Children are much more sedentary than ever they used to be, and there's many reasons for that. Part of that landscape is the development of technology. So where children might have gone outside and played a lot more in a social outside environment, they tend to be inside more and using technology for entertainment. It's not that I'm against technology. I think we certainly can't backpedal, but I think it needs to be considered within the framework of the education system, and looking at developing ways and different approaches to use a kinesthetic approach in the way that we deliver our education system. So dance can play a huge part in that reconsideration of our education system, I feel.
Great to know that. So I'll continue about school related relative connectedness to this program. The schools typically consider that the dance and the arts are more like extra subjects. They're not
Correct.
really like the subjects that are meant to be a part of the learning program. They're more meant to be extracurricular program. So where do you see the bridge, and how can, if a school system wants to incorporate your program into their usual business of day to day, where should they put it?
Yes, well, I think it is and has always been an issue for dance in particular. I think it's always been the poor sister of the arts in many ways, because it is hugely undervalued. The power of dance is hugely undervalued. It also sits in an interesting position because it straddles the physical activity program. So when we think about dance sitting in the education system, it's usually in the PE arena, the physical education arena, but it's also sitting in the arts arena, so it straddles the two. But I think that's what makes it entirely unique. As I've said, I think there needs to be a paradigm shift. I think we need to be informed much more, the educators and those people responsible for policy making in our education system, to understand how movement and dance specifically can impact children's learning. So that's why Movement Works is working towards contributing to this evidence base, and why we need to consider the whole landscape of our education system and reconsider where movement fits into that. The developmental dance programme is specifically an intentional programme to enhance cognitive development, and it's delivered through a physical dance movement approach. So it's a tool for learning. It's not learning to dance, but it's learning to learn through dance.
Sure. I'm sure that's a great quote from you, and that should be written down somewhere and maybe pasted on the wall. What challenges do you foresee if a school system or an education system takes care of their learning through, or makes sure that the developmental dance movement program is part of their whole bigger learning program? Where do you see the challenges at the moment?
Well, the challenges, I think, are global in terms of the lack of funds. Well, there are two issues here. I think, first of all, the one I've already mentioned, which is we need to raise awareness of how important the movement piece is, particularly for younger children who are developing their neural connections, because we know the brain is neuroplastic, and we know that children's optimal learning, where the brain develops the fastest over a shortest time period, is in their early years, from 0 to 7. So that's why the focus of the programme Developmental Dance Movement is looking at early years development in particular. And then when we've had a vehicle, and many vehicles such as this one, to raise awareness of the importance of movement, then we can start to try and make some inroads in the valuing of this kind of approach. And then I think the funds hopefully will start to become more available. We have some big challenges in terms of school funding for arts programs, and also children don't move enough in school. There's very little time. Recess time is often becoming more reduced because the focus has been on developing the more formal curriculum, and I think the whole thing needs a good shake-up, to use a movement analogy.
Sure. And if somebody wants to be trained and be specialized in a developmental dance and movement program, what will it take for this person to be a qualified person, to be a competent person to deliver the services?
Well, this is a new and innovative approach. So at the moment, Movement Works, although we have an international outreach, we deliver training nationally in terms of continuing professional development. So we work with disseminating this information, because it being really significant that we raise awareness in this area. We work with schools, we work with all kinds of educators, we work with delivering this information to therapists and to parents, because parents need to know this information as well. But in order to be able to deliver the specific program, Developmental Dance Movement, that currently happens as an internship because of the complexity and the way that the program builds. So at the moment, the actual delivery is UK-based and fairly London-centric at the moment, but we're building the organisation gradually to be able to start to take that into other areas. And certainly our research outreach is international, so along with Joe and Lara, we were delivering part of our research and a practical workshop at Harvard University in the summer at the Conference of Movement and Cognition, which was attended by some of the leading scientists who focus on this relationship between movement and cognition globally.
Sumitra Paul from Kolkata has a question for you, and it's about how and what can she do if she wants to develop a movement program in a preschool setup and in an Indian subcontinent kind of a geographical area. What should be the steps that she should take if she wants to establish a movement program at a preschool?
It's difficult to answer that question directly without knowing someone's prior experience, because in order to deliver a program, one needs to be able to draw on certain tools. So that's part of the objective of all of us coming over we did this conference in Delhi last week and now in Bangladesh, to give people, first of all, a baseline of understanding of how the expressive arts can help with learning objectives, particularly in the area of special educational needs. And then, once you start to have a background of knowledge and to give people some baseline tools, then you can build from there, once you have an understanding, and start to look at how you can then foster those skills to be able to deliver high quality dance movement intervention, music and movement program to your children. So I would look at the research. When I started developing the program, I have a background as a choreographer, so I have several decades of experience working with both movement delivery and movement observation, and then being informed by what we know from neuroscience. So to start to look at what information is out there, what you can draw on, and then developing your skills and your knowledge and bringing the whole thing together.
Yeah, sure. So I agree with you when you say there are prerequisite qualifications, prerequisite background, some experience, relevant experience in the field of children with you are intending to work with. But would you have some comments on what kind of procedure, what kind of administrative probably processes are to be followed if somebody was to start a kind of a collaborative effort with your program, or a replication of it, or an extension of the London program here in India or Bangladesh?
Well, I think in terms of an early, because the question was specific about an early year setting, in terms of an early year setting, the music and the movement piece has always been much more greatly valued than perhaps older children in a school setting. I mean, I think without music and movement in an early year setting, the children are very much having a less than optimal experience, because that's how children first access their language skills and the way that they need to integrate both their sensory development and their motor development. So I think, you know, there has to be a very important place for music and movement in an early year setting. In terms of being able to formalise that into a programme, that's, you know, years and years of working towards building this programme, which is quite considered to be quite groundbreaking and innovative. But as I say, bringing the work and showing the kind of tools that you can use through music, both sung music and the use of recorded music, and the understanding of what and why certain ways in through movement can help to engage and facilitate that child's development.
Our next question is by Safi, and the question is about how can we incorporate the movement therapy paradigm, the movement therapy kind of an learning and understanding in our everyday activities at home.
Very good. So this is a great question because it draws us back into the relationship between the Movement Works developmental dance movement program and autism movement therapy. That program was developed by Joanne Laura, who I believe is also going to be having a Facebook live interview. But I believe that Facebook live interview is focused on getting individuals getting into a work program, which is her current focus. And it seems like those two things don't have much of a relationship. But if you start to really think about and unpick it, you can start to join the dots between the fact that she has spent a decade developing and delivering, both from an educational point of view and from a practical point of view, the autism movement therapy program. And now those children, 10 years on, are in such a good place that she is advocating a work program that equates to them getting paid, because that one thing has facilitated the development into another. So I think that's a very important piece to understand, that something like an expressive arts program, whether that's appropriately delivered on an individual basis through art and music and or dance, can have such a significant impact that it can change the whole trajectory of a child's development.
So in your experience, Alison, what kind of children or what kind of difficulties that children have that have worked with you and have improved over a period of time?
There's lots of examples I could give. I like to anchor it in 3 ways to consider it. The first is what I call the psychological, and in particular, the social cognitive piece. Because if we think about it, when we send our children to a dance class or any physical activity or arts activity, group session, as a parent, you often want to send them there because we know that it builds confidence, it builds self-esteem, and it builds social skills, because we generally have to interact with our peers in order to work with them in an arts-based activity program. So that's the first piece. The second piece is the sensory motor piece, which we've already spoken about in terms of how that might cross over with occupational therapy. So dance is great because it is a full body experience. We can't separate our sensory and our motor development. They're very much interrelated. And the dance movement piece can help the development and optimal progression of that. And thirdly is the neuroscientific base, where we know that when we start to understand what and how we're doing, we can actually change the mapping of the brain and optimize that. And that can work equally well for optimizing the development of a neurotypical child, and especially well for optimizing the development of a child who has neurological differences.
In terms of practical applications of this program, dance and movement program with children, and culturally or traditionally, a lot of geographical areas are not very, there are people who may not be comfortable moving around, dancing in a setting which is being shared by others. There could be their own reservations about having a free flow of themselves as a using your body in a certain way. What do you see in the practicums that you have done during the conference or out of it? Do you feel that people take a lot of time to ice break and then finally reach to a point where they can be comfortable with themselves using such a program in order to then further use the same program with other children?
Yeah, I think it goes back, it's a good question, and I think it goes back to the whole landscape of how we think about movement and not realising how it supports all of our understanding, right from the fact that, you know, there's a large percentage of our understanding that's non-verbal, that we take completely for granted. And then, of course, we start to go through, to be filtered through an education system that makes us think that all the learning is in our head. And by the time we've grown up, we've had a complete disconnect from our body. So a lot of people feel uncomfortable about delivering any movement-based practice because of that disconnect. However, in the context of the conferences and the other presentations and workshops that I do, I find the complete opposite. I find that once people have got over the sort of general fear about, hang on a minute, you're going to ask me to move now, people very quickly feel reconnected. And you can actually see, I've got lots of footage of delivering this work at conferences and other presentations, and many photographs. You can see people's not just their physicality, but their face changes. Their face changes because the sheer joy of moving gets re-remembered. It gets, somehow that has got lost on the way. And it's a joyful experience to involve your whole body and reconnect with your whole body is a joyful experience. So I find actually once people get over that initial hurdle, the fear starts to dissipate. And because it's a shared experience, you know, dancing, generally speaking, you know, you dance with other people. And because it's a shared experience, that just enhances the pure joy. And it's one of the reasons, you know, that it works so well, because it's a great, enjoyable, fun thing to do. And every single culture, without exception, has music and dance at the heart of it somewhere. I don't think there's a culture that exists anywhere that doesn't have music and dance somewhere within it. And there's a good reason for that, because it's universal.
Sure, I'm sure about it. And children who come to us and those who come to you usually, sometimes we'll also have a lot of social anxiety, which means they will anyhow be very anxious about doing something that is self-directed, sharing something or sharing a space with other people. In your experience, did you had any children who were anxious earlier and they took some time, and did the program help them?
Absolutely. You know, as adults, we might be anxious about going into an environment where we're not sure what's going to happen. I like to liken it to sort of going to a party, really. Very rarely do we walk into a social party atmosphere, unless you're me, perhaps, and go straight into the middle of the dance floor and start dancing. We like to kind of check it out. And I think that's what children will do in that situation as well. They'll come into a session and they want to see kind of how it goes, what goes on around here. And I like to facilitate that. So as long as the child is showing some kind of interest, and that might be, you know, a tiny glimmer of that at the beginning, the activity and the joy that we just spoke about gradually draws them in. So I've had children who have been sat on the periphery of a session for seemingly quite a long time. But that doesn't mean that they're not interested, and it doesn't always mean that they're disengaged. It's just that they're observing, and there's value in that observation, and there's learning within that observation. And what I find is gradually children will begin to join in more and more, and I've got plenty of sort of case narratives where it might take across a whole year, but gradually children will join in. They'll start to join in 20% of the session, then 50% of the session, and then all of a sudden, you know, they're joining in 100% of the session, and those same children 6 months later are not only joining in the session, they're being a leader. They're leading the work because they start to feel comfortable.
And children with autism that you would have worked with, they may not really have the social anxiety a lot of times, but what they could or might have is the lack of sheer motor skills, the coordination required, the kind of sequencing required in a developmental dance and movement program. I'm sure it would be, it sounds challenging to imagine that children with autism who have a lot of times difficulties with their muscle tone, difficulties with their postures, and also difficulties with their coordinated movements, and to focus and to follow a sequence of steps. How will it be for those? What would it look like if a group of children with autism were taking up a dance and movement program?
Yeah, good question. So we know there is a correlation between movement and cognition. And so often the use of movement can be twofold. It can be an indicator of some neurological difference, and it's the appropriate intervention as well. So if we're working with a child with autism who has deficits in particular areas, what that will often look like through the lens of movement is poor coordination, poor balance, and difficulties with focus and concentration. And what we find is when we work on the skills, the motor skills, we find that the focus and concentration also improves along the same trajectory. So the skill, and it's going back to your question about how to facilitate this in an early year setting or in an educational setting, part of the skill is understanding where to set that bar, because you don't want to set it too low so that the child loses interest. And this will be the same in your field as well as an occupational therapist. It's constantly having an awareness of raising the bar just enough to support that intrinsic motivation, because that's the key to engagement, and then having the experience to know how to bring it up more and more so that the child's, they're always working towards just a little bit of a higher expectation that perhaps that they realise they're capable of.
Sure. Our next question is from Muhammad Rafiqul Islam from Dhaka, and his question is about what are the potential effects or outcomes of the developmental dance and therapy program in general population and in a clinical population.
Yeah, I think the potential positive outcomes are the same across the board. So we'd expect good progression in both fine and gross, or rather the other way around, both in gross and in terms of the developmental dance movement program, there are particular approaches that are there intentionally to support fine motor development as well. Using a rich sensory experience, and it is a full sensory experience, to support an optimal sensory rich diet. And then the social skill piece, which we've spoken about a lot, emotional development, so progression through emotional maturity, because often when we have a lack of physical balance, we often have an emotional imbalance as well. and many other aspects such as that are specific to children who have autistic spectrum conditions. So speech and language development is really key, and we see that a lot of children speak for the first time in the context of a dance and movement session, and there are lots of neurological reasons, I believe, why that happens. And we often see a reduction in the kind of behaviours that are associated with autistic spectrum conditions as well.
Another question by Rizwana Mustafa is it okay to support the child to follow the steps during a group session?
Good question. It depends what that word support means. What we want the children to develop and what we foster in the approach, and this is key to the kind of change that we want to happen in the brain. We want children to be moving independently, and while they're moving independently, we want to enhance their independent and imaginative and creative thought processes, because that's another area where children with autistic spectrum conditions can really struggle with their imaginative ideas and their creative thought. So how we can best support those children is through the way that we all learn, which is through imitation, by being the best model, by showing the children how we would like them to access the work, not doing it for them, and certainly not dancing for them, because then they're not really doing it independently.
Sure.
And they're not going to get the neurological benefits either that way.
I think where this question comes from, from my understanding, is that we frequently divide children into the mild, moderate, and severe categories. Mm-hmm. And the mild children would take up a dance movement program just as any other child, as an extracurricular probably. Mm-hmm. The moderate to severe typically would be thought about as just not capable of taking up, accepting, being a part of it, participating in a developmental dance and movement program, or the typical dance classes that children do aspire to attend to. At least I know that the feedback is that we did not continue because my child was not there yet. He was so moderate or severely challenged that he was just not, it didn't look great to the parent, mm-hmm. or to the trainer maybe, or to mm-hmm. both of them, to let the child be a part of it, saying probably this doesn't work for him, or probably this is mm-hmm. something of a higher level than what he's capable of. What would you suggest for children of three categories, mild, moderate, and severe? How can they, or what should they, are there any prerequisites for these children to take up a dance and movement program?
I think the level of expectation has to be considered as meeting the child where they are. So children who are at the sort of mild end of the spectrum are able to access the work more readily, and perhaps through an intentional intervention like developmental dance movement, like Joanne's autism movement therapy, those children with repeated exposure to the work can, and I have many cases of this, transition out of those programs and into a regular dance class. Children who are moderate to severe are going to need more exposure, more repetition, and more time to develop all of those skills that we've spoken about. But I think a lot of parents might be reserved and hesitant about exposing their children to this kind of work, thinking that there's no way they can do it, they won't be able to access it. I know that we're working currently in schools in London, in the UK, with children who are moderate to severe. We've had some fantastic outcomes with children who have been very profoundly affected by autism and additional needs and done incredibly well with the program. But of course, that doesn't happen overnight. It does need time. It does need regular exposure. And like all learning processes, repetition is key. So it does need repeated exposure to the work across a time period. But change is possible because we know that the brain is neuroplastic and change is possible at any age. It just takes longer. That's all of us, you know.
Yeah.
It takes longer the older we get.
One child-specific question from Shahidul Hassan is about his nephew who is 5.5 years old. He has some movement differences like walking on toes frequently, sitting on the floor like a W. He also has some difficulties during sitting on a toilet seat or a commode during doing the big job. Do you think these are movement problems?
They're certainly related or shown through, if we're looking at these things through the lens of movement, they are certainly related to what I would call motor processing difficulties. But going back to what we know about neuroanatomy, they're also related to sensory processing issues as well. So toe walking, for example, and I'm encroaching on your area possibly as an OT, so do feel free to jump in. But there can be all sorts of reasons why children toe walk. It can be a purely physical manifestation of really tight Achilles or tight calves. But generally speaking, especially if we already know that a child is in the arena of a diagnosis of autism, often there's a sensory reason why that child might be toe walking. Maybe they don't like the feel of the ground underneath their foot, or maybe they like the bouncing action and the feedback they're getting from that. Similarly, W sitting can be a developmental progression from not going through optimal movement experiences earlier on. It can also be an indication that they have got a lack of core stability, and so they're using their legs in that position to help stabilize them, and then they get kind of stuck in those movement patterns, because when we start to develop unhealthy postures, unhealthy walking patterns, we have to sort of regress and readdress those through a specific movement intervention in order to find a neutral baseline again. Otherwise, they don't go away.
Yeah. W sitting in particular, Alison, is a typical sign of hip joints being low tone or hypotonic. And certainly this profile that we have just discussed, it does look like that the toes, going on toes, maybe, you know, along with W sitting and having difficulty sitting on a toilet seat, there would be, of course, a professional input required to ascertain whether this is just sensory processing difficulty or sensory processing along with a sensory motor difficulty.
Correct.
So I would encourage the parent to, you know, take some advice, take some technical input on the related matter. Do you see a lot of children having concomitant problems with sensory processing and sensory motor problems going together?
Absolutely.
At the same time?
Absolutely, and it goes back to what we know about the neuroanatomy of the brain, and that those two cortex are next door neighbours, and so it starts. You know, it's very difficult. We are sensory motor beings. That's who we are first and foremost. From when we're first born, that's how we start to literally understand the world, is through our senses and through our movement development. Yep. They're really inseparable.
A continuation of her previous question by Rizwana Mustafa is that, can a mother be a shadow dancer with the autistic child or the teacher? Which conditions are the best for the child?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, by the term shadow dancer, I think you mean dancing by side or with them. Absolutely, being a really good, what we want is a good model. We want the children to be able to imitate, absolutely. I think the only consideration as far as working with your child in the context of another teacher, and this would have to be on a case-by-case basis, as we all know, some children, because it's such an intense and close relationship with a parent, sometimes parental presence might not be optimal, and children behave differently when their parents are around and when they're not around. So I guess that would have to be considered on a case-by-case basis. But certainly, as many people modelling the behaviour that we want to foster is a good thing.
Sure. Another question, child-specific question from Mustafiz Rahman, is about a 6 years old child who has the problem that when he watches TV or mobile phone with music, he would start jumping the stairs or jump or run around repetitively. When the child watches TV, most probably I understand it as something musical, or watches music being played or video being shown on a mobile phone, starts jumping on the staircase, starts jumping repetitively. And his question is, what can we do in that situation when it has just happened and we know that the music has started and the child has started jumping around? What should be the first step to take?
Well, if I'm understanding the question correctly, it sounds like the child is responding to music. Sounds to me like the child enjoys music. So I would say that that's something to foster, and that's something to develop, possibly through a more structured exposure to a dance and movement program. It sounds like that child would do very well with a dance and movement program. We know that, it's one of the reasons that we're here, and we were bringing the conference to Delhi and bringing the conference to Bangladesh, is because we know that children with autism often have a close connection with the arts. Maybe not all of them, because we're all individuals, but children with autism connect often with music where they don't connect necessarily with any other form of communication. We know that children who have autism can sing even if they can't speak. Other children are drawn towards more traditional art modalities. So I think if I've understood the question correctly and the parents can see that there is a connect with music, that's something to consider developing.
Sure. I think what the question also leads to an important aspect is that about the difficulties in regulating yourself that we typically see in children having autism or more so sensory processing difficulties, not just in autism but otherwise. What would you suggest if parents do identify that there is a connect and there is a response, like you just said? They need to take encouragement from it, of course, but what would you suggest them to make sure that they are at least promoting or going in line of developing some self-regulation along with an interest in dance and movement? So they should not say no to it completely, because then the child is getting a very negative reinforcement towards his interest towards music. But at the same time, it sounds like that there could be children who can go into an overexcitability kind of a trigger by the same dance movement or videos that they are anyhow exposed to.
Yep.
What would be the suggestion to make sure that the music and dance produces a therapeutic effect at home, but also is not leading or becoming a trigger for difficulties in regulating your own behaviors, especially in young children?
Yeah, good question. I'll deal with it in two parts. First of all, in terms of technology, we can all be overstimulated. And I think if a child is responding and overreacting or being overstimulated by technology, because when we're considering the specific question, a music video, that child can be overstimulated not just by the music aspect, but I mean, music videos, generally speaking, are cut to be very fast changing. It's what our young children and our new generation of teenagers and young adults are used to, and that can be a very overstimulating visual input. And also you have the lights can be overstimulating from a video from a room.
Exactly.
So the behaviour might be attributed to the music when actually there are a lot of other factors involved in that behaviour. If we start to strip that back and we know that it's not overstimulation from technology in general, then you can start to manipulate the environment by making intentional choices about what kinds of music that you are going to expose the child to get the desired response. So if you have a child who is reacting in a very hyperactive way to a piece of music, then you might want to consider the opposite dynamic, because we work in dynamics both in music and dance, and choose something quite soothing. If you have a child that is very unresponsive physically, you might want to choose a piece of music that has a very upbeat and faster rhythm, because we know that we respond to music from a human point of view with our body physiologically. So we can actually change the way that we respond to music physiologically. It's a process that just happens. So we can manipulate that in order to serve that individual child and help them regulate themselves in the environment.
Sure. Another child-specific question from Neelu Rahman, and I'm sure we would have discussed a large part of it already when we talked about self-regulation and music responsiveness, is that the child, when he watches cartoons and movies and sounds, he starts jumping quite high, it seems, and also gets extremely excited to the extent that he doesn't even feel pain, just in case there is some impact coming to the joints and body and muscles. And the question then is, what should I do?
Well, I think it's almost the same answer, isn't it? You have to think about all the variables in the environment. The child is obviously in this situation very excited about the cartoon, and there could be a number of factors involved, some of which I've answered in the previous question. It could just be the overstimulation of the entire environment. It could just be a combination of a couple of aspects of that. It could be the animation as well. I mean, we know a lot of children who have a diagnosis of autism are drawn towards animation, and that's often because when we're thinking about an animated cartoon or an animated video, the emotions, the faces are often clearer and easier to understand, and that excitement could be connected with that as well. So I think, once again, you have to strip back the variables and start to unpick what the situation is, and then you can start to manipulate the environment to help support that child best.
Sure. Tanya Khan has a question about her son, who is 6.5 years old, diagnosed with ADHD and ASD. He is very good in his memory, he's very good in his academics, but at the same time weak in mathematics. So the other aspect about his profile is that he is very obsessed about watching elevators. At some point of time, he used to have just the opposite and had anxiety and fear towards elevators. but at present he's so excited about watching them that he sometimes is uncontrollable with his emotions. Her question then is, can movement therapy, by the description that we have been talking about since now about learning and emotion, and her question is, can movement therapy in this case, in her child's case, can help the child to improve learning of mathematics probably, and also can have any control over his emotions?
That's quite a complex question. So I'm going to deal with the mathematics bit first, and then I'll deal with the emotional aspect. So there are lots of aspects of music and of dance and movement that have a relationship to mathematics. They're both, I mean, if you think about music, it's full of patterns, and maths is full of patterns. And then you've got the spatial aspects, because much of maths is about spatial understanding. So there's lots of relationship there, and I'm without doubt, I think both music and dance, and a combination of both, can certainly help mathematical understanding. And I believe there's research out there to support that. In terms of emotional development and the heightened interest in elevators, I think all children go through a particular age and stage of their development when they're drawn to particular things. And that's usually an indicator that whatever they're drawn to, what they have a keen interest in, is a particular area that's related to their sensitive period. So I think if you're able to steer that interest and again manage it in a way that becomes an intrinsic motivator for that child, that's got to be a good thing. In terms of the way that movement and emotional development are related, I think I've already touched on that in a previous question. There is a correlation between emotional stability and physical stability. And if you think about a toddler and the way that they are developing their physical stability along with their emotional stability, and a child that has developmental delay, that can often happen at a later stage of development. So without knowing the specifics of this individual child, I would certainly just put it out there that, you know, there can definitely be a strong correlation, a strong relationship between those two things.
I think we are about to have our time up, and Tanya Khan's the last question that I would take up is that what would be the source of learning for a program based on dance and movement, where if anybody wants to learn, I'm sure the conference is all full at the moment, and it's already under quite ahead of progression. Where and what is the source of learning for anybody?
Well, I think you can certainly come to my website and access further conversation through www.movementworks.org, and I'm sure Joanne Lara with Autism Movement Therapy, which is autismmovementtherapy.org, would equally be happy to answer any interest in learning about this work further.
That was Alison Golding, the faculty for the ongoing Expressive Arts Conference at ICDDR Dhaka. Alison, thank you so much for being with us, and thank you everyone for participating.